All right. Psychedelic Christianity, real and imagined. Was the original Eucharist a psychedelic? Were the original Christian communities entheogenically supercharged? Was Jesus actually a mushroom? As John Allegro convincingly argued, or not. These are simply some of the questions that historians of drugs field on a regular basis. And to be clear, our answers are almost always disappointing. Let me explain why. All of the arguments that suggest a psychedelic origin of Christianity are pure conjecture. There is simply no solid proof that Christianity had a psychedelic origin or that ancient Christians used psychedelics. Yet, as the expression goes, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And I, like my colleague Charles Stang here, we anticipate that some archaeo-chemists will eventually unearth a vessel that demonstrates some Christians in some part of the ancient world use some sort of psychedelic sacrament in their worship. And why not? Over the last few millennia, humans across the globe have used a variety of psychedelic substances to access visionary states of consciousness. This vast pharmacopoeia includes plants, roots, vines, cacti, nuts, herbs, nectar, roots, snuffs. You get the picture. There is no doubt that psychedelic substances have played a key role in human culture, animating religious rituals, rites of passage, communal ceremonies, not to mention healing, sorcery, divination, communion with the dead, and all of that continues to the present day. But again, no proof amongst Christians in the ancient world. Considering my time allocation, I'm not going to belabor this point by mapping all of the deficiencies in the arguments suggesting a psychedelic origin of Christianity. Rather, I'm going to focus on the very real stakes involved with this preoccupation with an imagined psychedelic Christian origin, as opposed to the real traditions of psychedelic Christianity. To truly see the stakes here, we're going to have to understand how scholars have read and misread the role of psychedelics in the human story. The literature on the global history of psychedelics is broken into two competing narratives. The first and most pervasive argument totally denies the basic fact that psychedelics have played a role in human religion and spirituality since time immemorial. Following this common sense logic of the drug war, this approach essentializes mind-altering drugs along with their users as primitive, degenerate, and/or antisocial. This ideologically hostile view is called pharmacological Calvinism, in reference to the Protestant reformer John Calvin, who insisted that divine grace is predetermined by God. Pharmacological Calvinists likewise deny that any claim on the sacred, Christian-coded or otherwise, can be accessed on demand, especially via drugs. All right, so that's the mainstream view. We've got it out of the way. Let's move on to the second most prominent view with respect to psychedelic Christianity. This talk is called Psychedelic Christians, Real and Imagined, so let's move on to the imagined communities of psychedelic Christians. This imaginative approach was pioneered by what I call the entheogenic school. This school insists that Jesus, his disciples, and the earliest Christian communities utilized a psychedelic sacrament. The entheogenic school is based on a maximalist interpretation of psychedelics' impact on human culture. According to this school, psychedelics catalyzed the birth of humanity's religious imagination somewhere in the Neolithic, and then continued to shape human culture as it moved into archaic shamanism, the world's earliest religious tradition, which then inspired the world's oldest religious scriptures, the Rig Veda, and on and on and on through the ancient world, eventually until we get to the Eucharist of the Paleo-Christian Church, which, surprise, surprise, was also psychedelic. The entheogenic school starts with the foregone conclusion that psychedelics stand behind the world's religious traditions, including humanity. Evidence to the contrary is simply ignored. These are the foremost texts of the entheogenic school, and perhaps you recognize Brian Mororescu's immortality key, which, in my opinion, is the most convincing of the lot. But while his findings are inconclusive, his study does raise an important point. Why are scholars only now discussing the history of Christianity with respect to psychedelics? Mr. Mororescu's bold exploration exposes the deeply seated pharmacological Calvinism at play amongst scholars and Christian theologians. And this prejudice is all the more serious today for contemporary psychedelic Christians who are scouring the ancient past for a precedent to legitimize their current psychoactive sacramentalism. However, I believe that they're looking in the wrong direction. And this brings us to the third and final school, which I call the empiricist school. This school does not begin with a reduction of psychedelic drugs to narcotics or their elevation as mystical sacraments. Instead, this school works from the available evidence to focus on the traditions of real, active, and influential psychedelic Christians. In this view, psychedelics are not, on one hand, reduced to an inherently dangerous narcotic, or on the other hand, reduced to mystical sacraments. Rather, empiricists remain value neutral with respect to the meanings, effects, and social significance of psychedelics. Working from an evidentiary basis, if today's psychedelic Christians are looking for a precedent, then they should cast their attention to the real traditions that stretch out over the last century, possibly much longer, maybe even half a millennium. Here, I'm talking about the Native American Church, for example, founded in 1918, but drawing on a millennia of tradition, which today hosts upwards of 200,000 congregants. Leaving aside its offshoots and its schisms, many of its branches utilize peyote as its sacrament instead of communion, wafer, and wine. But that's not it. There's also the Mazateca curandera Maria Sabina, who inherited an indigenized Catholic system of religious healing centered on psilocybin mushrooms, which were venerated as terrestrial saints. And there are many, many, many more Christian psychedelic communities that bear mention here, such as the Amazonian Santo Daime Church and the Bwiti of Gabon. Let's be clear here. There are stakes involved in focusing on actual psychedelic traditions. The traditions mentioned above have centuries of accumulated experience dealing with the extreme alteration of consciousness. Each is a repository of firsthand knowledge of the street-level realities, both heaven and hellish, of psychedelic Christianity. And here I'm talking about exaltation, miraculous healing, prophecy, dark nights of the soul, angelic intercession, demonic invasion. To be clear, imagined communities offer no such insights, whereas empirical communities do. But I get why contemporary psychedelic Christians of Euro descent are hesitant to look at the empirical evidence and prefer an imagined past. Cultural appropriation being what it is, not to mention the federal judiciary's double standard with respect to psychoactive sacraments, I get it. So I'm going to end my talk with a micro-tradition that is much closer to home for white psychedelic Christians today. And this is a micro-tradition that is almost forgotten, at least by scholars and practitioners alike. And here, I'm talking about the Jesus people, so-called Jesus freaks of the 1970s. To quote my pal Eric Davis, it's important to remember just how common Christian imagery was to freaks on psychedelics. Having a Christ trip, crucified and all, was almost run-of-the-mill in some corners. My time's nearly up, so let me draw attention to the stakes involved in returning empirically to these stoned long hairs for Christ. Within this micro-tradition, from the theosophical Anglican priest Alan Watts to the iconic SoCal cartoonist Rick Griffin, to the beatnik Zen Catholic Jack Kerouac, to the science fiction theologian Philip K. Dick, we find the same warning appearing again and again and again. What are they saying? They say psychedelics lend themselves just as easily to salvific grace as they do to the megalomaniacal Christ trip. That's right, the Messiah complex. It is no secret psychedelics generate profound feelings of divinity, which often translate to the sense of being chosen for a sacred mission. This is part of the package, people. This is part of what it means to do psychedelics in post-war America. Ego inflation of this sort is not a historical quirk, but an all too real danger. Just ask anyone embedded in today's psychedelic scene within and outside the therapeutic wellness zone. This issue, which is related to an assortment of other risks, is precisely what is left out of the conversation when we focus on an imagined past. All right, I'm gonna wrap up now. I'm not concerned as an empirical historian with the supposed origins of a psychedelic Christianity. As I said before, who cares? Representing the empirical perspective, the very real lessons to be learned from the very real traditions that exist all around us today are far more important. These lessons are directly applicable to Christians as well as any other faith traditions that are interested in implementing psychedelic substances. Thanks so much for your time.